Hi, everybody. Um, Welcome to the Brooklyn Book Festival's virtual day. My name is Hirsh Sawhney, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the festival for a conversation with Jessamine Chan, Lidia Yuknavitch, and Matt Johnson. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by the authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. I'm going to start things off by briefly reading the biographies of our panelists today. Jessamine Chan is a former reviews editor at Publishers Weekly. Her first novel, The School for Good Mothers, is a New York Times bestseller. She lives in Chicago with her husband and daughter, and she's done a whole lot more, but that's it for now. In my reading of it, Lidia Yuknavitch is a nationally best-selling author of the novels The Book of Joan, The Small Backs of Children, and Dora, a Head Case, among other books. She is the recipient of 2 Oregon Book Awards and has been a finalist for the Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize. She lives in Oregon, and Thrust is her latest novel. Matt Johnson is a Philip H. Knight Chair of the Humanities at the University of Oregon. His publications include the novels Loving Day and Pym. His latest novel is Invisible Things. Johnson is the recipient of the American Book Award, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the John Dos Passos Prize for Literature, among other accolades. Each of these authors has written a novel with protagonists who are forced to confront abusive power structures, either in the form of a police state or a surveillance state. And though these works are distinctly speculative in nature, or either very directly or implicitly works of science fiction, they hold up a rather chilling mirror to the world we are living in right now. So welcome, panelists, and welcome audience members out there across the country and across New York City. I'm going to start off the conversation with a question for, folks, would you like to read a little bit from your books today, like for a couple of minutes? Lydia,
Sure.
does it? Yeah. All right. Why don't we start off with that? Lydia, I'm going to ask you to read for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to pose you a question, and I'm going to do the same thing for everyone else. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, here I go. A father and a daughter in a dilapidated apartment, squatting without permission. What's the object in your hand? Tell me the story of my mother, and I'll tell you what the object in my hand is. The daughter laughs like a daughter caught in domestic comfort, as if that was possible. For a second, the words mother and daughter make him bite down his back teeth hard enough to make his temples pulse. Sometimes all a father can do is smile for his daughter and give her the story she desires. Perhaps in fairy tale form, children can live with what really happens. The walls of the kitchen press in on them. The cracks and splotchy paint scratches his body like old skin. The smallness and cold mold of the entire apartment tightens their existence. He steals a glance at her. Once there was a star in the sky who fell in love with a fur spinner, he begins. His daughter's smile widens with satisfaction. She keeps turning the object in her hand out of sight beneath the kitchen table where she sits. And they lived across water in a place that used to have land bridges, and the land bridges before them carried their ancestors. She answers, "Who's telling the story?" he says. "You are," Leisve says. She laughs again. Far enough back in time, a land called Siberia. Though before that land was taken over, it had other names. Where is Siberia? He walks over to the tiny kitchen window, crisscrossed with duct tape covering cracks in the glass and sealing the edges. On the wall nearby is an old map from the turn of the last century. He's made this journey across the kitchen before. He's told his daughter this story many times. It doesn't matter how many times. Siberia lived inside what used to be Russia, and before that it was the Soviet Union. Here, he puts his finger there. What were they like? Countries. Was the Soviet Union a bad place or a good place? Was Siberia? Was America? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on who's telling the story. Time moves. You're telling the story. Nations were like forever dancing animals. Sometimes one was the prey, sometimes the other, sometimes they both were, but neither one knew it. Nations used to be forged by wars and power, and Siberia, it was kind of an enigma. What's enigma? Am I telling the story? He began again. I could not love this girl more. In fact, sometimes I think this is all I have left of love. The way I carry it in my body, my love for her may kill me. That's what happens when love is desperate, when it's filled with a skin-shivering terror, when your fear is that what you love will be lost or taken away.
Thank you. Thank you for that moving reading, Lydia. What a wonderful way to begin the session. Just to catch some of our audience members up. So it's the 2080s for much of your novel. Climate change has unsurprisingly led to all forms of global devastation, especially on the coasts, so much so that the Statue of Liberty itself is underwater. Refugees are under constant threat from, quote, armed men in vans snaking like killer whales through the streets, taking people away to God knows where. When I read those parts of your novel, I can't help but think of so many aspects of our life today. I can't help but think of the way in which the US government and various state governments within the nation are treating migrants and refugees in this very moment. Probably a few years after you actually wrote your book, or a couple of years after. Couple kind of general questions to begin things. How did the crisis of contemporary migration impact you as you were doing all this work? How is it to be parsing through material that has such contemporary resonance? And the follow-up question to that is, what called you to science fiction for these particular themes?
Thank you for including me, and thank you for the question. I'm in such good company. I'm trying not to pee my pants, actually. The struggles of immigration and migration, and who has power and who does not, and what does it mean to move around in the world, were, of course, like a knot in my stomach in our times. But it's a struggle in every epoch. And so it leads me to your second question about why speculative, or why inhabit that space. And I think for me, the beauty of speculative fiction is that it can move forward and backwards in time. It's sort of a liminal space, and the speculation can hop or be quantum in time slightly differently than traditional science fiction. And so because I was crossing time periods, you were kind not to tell anyone there are 3 different time periods, because that scares them. Because I was making time into a fluid space, the speculative form of storytelling let me tell old stories and new stories, and even palimpsests of stories where they collect and stack and repeat and move around. And so I don't feel as if I was writing about the future. I feel as if I was writing history and the future and the present tense as interwoven in a very fraught knot, because that's how I feel I'm living right now in the world we've made.
Sounds like a way of almost kind of putting an end to, or collapsing the
Yes,
apparent linearity of time, really.
completely.
Did you have any models, or heroes in terms of the speculative and its capacity to parse through time in this particular way?
Well, You know, I may have an orientation to literature that's weird, because I mean, so here, Murakami is a huge influence on me, because time collapses or becomes fluid at an extraordinarily beautiful rate. But I would call books like Toni Morrison's Beloved a version of speculative fiction because of the ancestral back and forth and torques and fluid motion of what it means to be haunted, or how history enters individual bodies. So I think I have a really broad definition of speculative that includes, you know, literature that may or may not have much to do with classical science fiction.
When I was reading your novel, I thought of Borges sometimes,
Yes,
in very nice ways. Um,
yes, yes. That
um,
when I first encountered Borges in my 20s, I just went and sat in a park under a tree for about 4 years. I just
okay.
thought, this is astonishing. I have to change my life.
I don't know if any of you all have caught this particular writer, but the Argentine novelist and story writer Samantha Schweblin does really amazing things along the very lines you're
Yep.
describing, and with the speculative. So
Right. Right.
she could have been here with us right now. It would have been a good fit. All right. We are going to come back and talk more to Lydia in a little while. But right now we're going to turn to Matt. And Matt, if you'd be willing to read for a couple of minutes, that'd be great. And then I also have a couple of questions for you.
Great. I was looking for ones that speak directly to the topic, like parts of the book. So the section I'm reading from, there's an event that public event that turns into a riot, and it turns into a riot because somebody yells the word home, and all the people here are stuck on a colony in Jupiter, and they've been kidnapped from Earth, and they're a little sensitive about the home word. There was no way Naleni could have known the misuse of the single word home was considered an affront to New Roanoke and mainstream political, religious, and philosophical sensibilities, or known the essay On Home, written in 1623 by the founding mother Virginia Dare, and considered the seminal text of both the Church of the Collected and the Founders Party, or that this essay eventually laid the groundwork for the belief that New Roanokeans were collected by God to inherit the newer world, or that the reason it was rare to hear the word home uttered by locals was that it was believed that even saying the word out loud was blasphemous and might possibly, maybe probably, rile up those invisible things it was best one avoided. Or that, as Naleni and the rest of the crowd understood, committing this blasphemy amid the safety in numbers meant that those invisible things couldn't go after everyone. Naleni forgave this mistake. She didn't realize, even after 29 months adjusting to her knife on this moon 444 million miles away from home, and she was still learning. Home, 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 they chanted. It was exhilarating, giving Naleni a pulse that matched the beat. The cops providing security for the event had a much more practical response to the intoxication of the moment, and they had the billy clubs to express their emotions. To his credit, the senior officer directly in front of Naleni did bellow, "Stand down," to his visibly distraught fellow officers. It was a clear and admirable attempt on his part to de-escalate the situation. Whoever he was a good cop. But then he got hit with the shoe in the head, and upon recovering, said to no one in particular, "Last warning, disperse," in a rather perfunctory tone, before transforming into a bad cop. He started swinging. Under the cover of air assault, Naleni lifted the discarded megaphone again and let everybody know what she was really thinking. "Everybody, chill out. We have a ship. We are getting out of here. We're going home." And though this did not spark another chant from the crowd, preoccupied as they were being beaten, it was enough to gather the attention of the seersucker bureaucrat on stage. "Arrest that woman!" Vice Deputy Chairman Dick Cole yelled into his microphone, pointing at her, at Naleni. Immediately, the police officer snapped his head in her direction. He met Naleni's eyes, and there he saw his relief at having a simple command to follow in an otherwise complex universe. The officer approached with his hands out before him, as if preparing for a hug. Nalini closed her eyes and braced for impact. It never came. And when she opened her eyes to look again, Nalini saw the officer's feet were where his head had been. He was floating about a foot in the air, upside down. Oh shit, it's real, was Nalini's first thought. That's
Thank
that.
you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for reading that powerful section. So you've written a satirical speculative novel that takes place on one of Jupiter's moons, where human beings have pretty much brought the worst aspects of American life and politics to reside there with them. And those who arrived first in this far-off colony occupy a special place of privilege. You've written about the politics and themes and histories that seem to be at the heart of this book in your other work, but this time in a very different tone and medium, using a very different palette. So I'm going to start off with a similar question to the one I recently posed to Lydia, which is, yeah, what called you to this particular realm of storytelling?
Well, I think the biggest thing was that initially I wanted to get away from the exact context that we're in. And because so many of our discussions now about, you know, our current reality are based on all these touchstones, that as soon as you say specific words, people have this idea, this is what you're thinking, this is what you're going for. And it just becomes this kind of trap. And a lot of my writing, I think about like dreams. Like in dreams, the place can be almost as identical, the people, you know, almost identical, but everything is cut up and done in this sort of collage. So your grandmother might be in that dream, but in real life, your grandmother could not dunk a basketball, right? Or, you know, or you turn this corner and, you know, at the end of your house, you usually don't end up in Antarctica, right? So, but the reason your brain slices those things up and puts them together is because they're trying to avoid the obstacles of the conscious mind. And they're trying to get around to information and to truth without having your brain immediately shut down because, you know, it goes into the set pattern. Like one way I think about this with, I'm sure the other, all of you probably know this, if you're ever interviewed, they ask you questions like, you know, very simple questions that you've answered 100 times, you immediately, no matter if you're not trying to, you go into the same set answers that you do, you know, all those times. And so that's why people ask crazy questions like, you know, if you could be a Kool-Aid, what flavor would you be? Because it knocks you out for a second. And so that's what like the speculative kind of realm offers to me, is a chance to throw myself and the reader off balance for a minute, and a chance to look at things in a way that are nonlinear, that are non-specific, that are free from the kind of detritus of facts, and more about the question of truth.
Were you thrown off balance in a generative or productive way? Did of course, when an artist enters any project, they come out the other side evolved and shaped and changed in different ways, but was there some specific way in which this type of work changed you or enabled you to kind of reacquaint yourself with some of your fixed ideas about things?
Yeah, I mean, I don't start with answers. I usually start with questions, and the goal isn't to get answers from me, it's to get better questions, you know, by the end of it. And if there isn't a moment where I'm just scared shitless and I'm thinking this thing is going to, you know, collapse and what was I thinking, then it's not working right, because I need to be like, I'm not good enough to be lazy. There really are. There's some writers who are that good that they can just mail it in and write while they're eating a sandwich. I have to feel like I'm on the edge and I have a great chance of failure. And it's when I'm in that position that I can be far more creative. And I know from past, the more I get in that position, you know, the better the work is going to be. But then also sometimes it fails completely, but at least it fails in a really lovely way. You know, it's better to fail in a unique way than and then succeed in the same way everybody else is, you know, artistically speaking, not commercially, but artistically speaking. So yeah, there was points here where I tried to do some things that didn't, in my mind, work. I tried to remove it completely from a North American, British, French context as to, you know, this societal moment. And there was a bunch of things I found in there were simply not possible. But like you brought up in the beginning, power structures based on who got to the land first. You just can't take those away, you know, because if you do, it doesn't make any sense. So it was kind of cool in seeing what I could take away and what was more universal and what I couldn't, and what was very specific to this moment and specific to, you know, the issues that North America and some of Europe are going through as well.
It's, you know, heartening to hear about the way in which, or to be reminded of the way in which risk, recklessness are essential to the process, or your process, and I know to many people's process, that sense of not being in control being essential to eventually finishing something that is indicative of a hell of a lot of control, really. Real quickly, in the back of my mind, as I was reading your novel, I'm an Alice Munro fan, and the whole time I was like, moons of Jupiter, moons of Jupiter. I don't know if that story was one that was ever a part of your consciousness. But are there, in addition to that, just any models that worked for you or inspired you in this particular type of work? I was thinking about, as I was reading your book, Stanley Kubrick sometimes, but you tell us, please.
Yeah, I mean, you know what, I know that story, and I honestly did not think about it till you made the connection just now.
Okay.
So it might have been in there in the back. Yeah, I mean, every time I'm thinking about a new one, I'm reading, you know, other work. I mean, as far as like people before, like I in college, I fell in love with Derek Bell's writing, and I was really excited by the idea that you could have this speculative side and this this other side that was, you know, engaging. But you know, it's interesting because it really kind of, for me, before the novel, I'm reading all this stuff and all of like Can, and you know, I'm reading, you know, Jasmine's work and Lydia's work. You know, I think I finished Book of Joan right before this, and like I'm always trying to see like what the current conversation is, and that's always fascinating, you know. And you can't really jump in unless you hear how the conversation's going, and then but all that conversation is informed by the past too, right? So you know, you have to come in also with this library. So I think like with this book in particular, I went back and looked at some of the ones that I fell in love with, that there were kind of dystopian kind of books, or utopian books. I mean, there's no real dystopia, there's all kind of utopias, but you know, ultimately, I think those are ideas that help me with structure and narrative and how to do the physical craftsmanship aspect. The more inspirational parts were just watching the TV and watching the world go to hell. And like, that was kind of like, you couldn't ask for better inspiration than like the last 8 years. Like, it just, you know, hopefully we'll get a lot of good art out of this moment.
Thank you, Matt. We're gonna turn to Jasmine, who is going to read for us before I pose a couple questions to her. Hi, Jasmine, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, and thank you to the Brooklyn Book Festival. It's really surreal to be here, and I'm definitely listening as both a fan and a student. So I'm happy to represent the newbies here, but it's really an honor to be on this panel. So I'm going to read the first 2 pages of the book because I'm hoping that the speculative element of the book comes at a bit of a surprise to readers. So I'm going to just begin at the beginning. We have your daughter. It's the first Tuesday in September, the afternoon of her one very bad day, and Frida is trying to stay on the road. On the voicemail, the officer tells her to come to the station immediately. She pauses the message, puts down her phone. It's 2:46 p.m. She meant to get home an hour and a half ago. She pulls onto the first side street off Grace Ferry and double parks. She calls back and begins apologizing, explaining that she lost track of time. Is she okay? The officer says the child is safe. Ma'am, we've been trying to reach you. Frida hangs up and calls Gus, has to leave a message. He needs to meet her at the station at 11th and Wharton. There's a problem, it's Harriet. Her voice catches. She repeats the officer's promise that their daughter is safe. As she begins driving again, she reminds herself to stay under the speed limit, to avoid running red lights, to breathe. All through Labor Day weekend, she felt frantic. Last Friday and Saturday, she had her usual insomnia, sleeping 2 hours each night. On Sunday, when Gus dropped off Harriet for Frida's 3.5 days of custody, Harriet was in the throes of an ear infection. That night, Frida slept 90 minutes, last night an hour. Harriet's crying has been relentless, too big for her body, too loud for the walls of their tiny house to absorb. Frida did what she could. She sang lullabies, rubbed Harriet's chest, gave her extra milk. She laid on the floor next to Harriet's crib, held her impossibly perfect hand to the bars, kissed her knuckles, her fingernails, feeling for the ones that needed to be trimmed, praying for Harriet's eyes to close. The afternoon sun is burning as Frida pulls up to the station, located 2 blocks from her house in an old Italian neighborhood in South Philly. She parks and rushes to the reception desk, asks if the receptionist has seen her daughter, a toddler, 18 months old, half Chinese, half white, big brown eyes, curly dark brown hair with bangs. You must be the mother, the receptionist says. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jasmine, for reading that. The School for Good Mothers is about Frida, a struggling first-time mom who leaves her baby unattended after a very bad day. There's a state surveillance system in place, and she gets sent to a reform program for bad mothers and might, in fact, lose her daughter. Can you talk to us about the way young mothers and the way they might be scrutinized by our society, judged by our society, shaped your book, or in generally how your perceptions of motherhood shape this book? I've certainly observed how a lot of people have a lot of opinions about what mothers do with their time and lives and bodies when they have small children. It's quite remarkable, really, to see how strangers feel like they have agency to accost people and tell people what to do. So yeah, talk to us.
Sure. So the book really began for me in both a personal way and in terms of intellectual interest. So I started it in 2014 at a time when I was really ruminating constantly about the big question of whether or not to have a child. So I know that my daughter will have things to say about this when she's older, with all my talk about maternal ambivalence and how my book grew out of maternal ambivalence. But it was a hard decision to choose that path. And I was in my mid-30s, and it felt like time was bearing down on me and forcing me to make a decision. So I was already thinking a lot about motherhood. And around that time, I happened to read the New Yorker article called "Where is Your Mother?" by the journalist Rachel Aviv. And something about that story just really lodged in my mind and heart and just made me so angry. So that story is about a single mom who left her young son at home for a stretch of time. The neighbors called the police, and after that day, she never got him back. Like, she had to undergo a series of supervised visits and a lot of hearings with various family court judges, and she was just never given a second chance. And something about that story just really stayed with me. I didn't have a notebook out, and I wasn't getting ready to say like, oh, this might be the basis for my first novel. But it was more that I was really just taken with that question of justice and like who gets to make those choices. And I think how that led me in a speculative direction was that something about the incredibly cold and clinical tone with which they talked about mothering and parenting and love just reminded me of science fiction in a way. It was kind of terrifying, because they talked about love as something you can measure, and they talked about maternal instincts as something you can measure. And it felt like no one would really be able to, under that type of scrutiny and that type of pressure, live up to those standards. So in a way, I think my book takes the feeling that all parents have of being watched and makes it literal.
That you'd think after 3 years of this, I'd remember to stop muting myself. I still do it in my classes. My question is, have you ever connected with Rachel Aviv during or after the birth of the book?
So I am still working up the courage to write her a fan letter and send her a
Okay.
copy. I mean, the thing is, like, we have a close friend in common, so
Yeah.
it's very possible for me to ask for her address, but I don't know, it just feels so intimidating to say, like, you provided the spark of inspiration for my first novel, but I'm gonna get there. I mean, I've fangirled over her a lot in every single interview and like podcast and everything, but I'm happy to fangirl over her here too. She has a new book out called Strangers to Ourselves, and I'm dying to read. But I'm going to send the fan letter this fall, I swear.
Maybe she's out working on her own fan letter right now. Maybe. It's amazing how the sparks of our creative work are, we can't predict what they will be. We can't really know what's going to stick and resonate in that kind of uncanny, ineffable way that leads us down these paths. It's kind of hopeful to remember it, because I know there are moments in our creative lives when we feel quite bereft, right? When nothing can spark us. And it's just nice to remember that they come out of nowhere sometimes, and when they stick, they kind of lodge into us like a burr that we can't get rid of. So when I was reading your book, and when frankly, for a lot of the work that's under discussion today, I thought about some unsurprising names, Orwell for sure, and I thought about Edward Snowden all the time, and so much of the work of the three novels that are up today, they have so many kind of poignant and incisive things to say about, of course, all of human history, but certainly, as Matt mentioned, the past 8 or so years. But I also was thinking about how, like, things have often been bad, and even before the Trump presidency, we had such deep, deep problems with our state security apparatus. And this panel is called The Police State. And I couldn't help but think about those Obama years and what was going on with metadata and what was going on with drone strikes, which was, obvious, to say the obvious, and to understate it, very problematic. So I got 2 passages for Jessamine, but really for everyone on the panel. So here's Orwell. You had to did live from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every moment scrutinized. Jessamine, that really reminded me of what was going on with your protagonist. Here's Snowden on privacy. Privacy is the fountainhead of all other rights. Freedom of speech doesn't have a lot of meaning if you can't have quiet space, a space within yourself, within your mind, within the community of your friends, within your home, to decide what it is you actually want to say. Here's one more from our friend Edward Snowden. Under observation, we act less free, which means we effectively are less free. I think about that stuff all the time. I'm very, very wary of the way in which being constantly surveilled, being constantly recorded. I hate being recorded. I do feel like I act differently, how it impacts my thought processes, my creative work, the teaching I do, the type of friend I might want to be. So my question first to you, Jessamine, is what do you in your book have to tell us about privacy and surveillance, about the possibility of being fulfilled individuals in a world in which we are constantly being surveilled, sometimes by our own design?
That's an amazingly tough question, but I will try to answer it. So I think circling back to what you were saying earlier about what our books talk about, how our books talk about the past 8 years, I actually started my book back in 2014. So I couldn't necessarily have anticipated it emerging in 2022, but I guess I wanted the book to both talk about what surveillance could be in the future, but also reflect on how different communities in America have been surveilled for generations, for decades, and the way that race and class affect how much parents are being watched and whether or not they get in trouble at all. So I think one thing that's been surprising to me as I've talked about the book is that the problems, the inherent inequality in the child welfare system is news to a lot of people, even though the problems have been going on for so many decades. So I think it's both calling upon like the history of inequality in the system, and also looking at like how technology is going to make that more sinister. I have no idea if that just answered the second much more complex question.
Definitely, it was certainly. Thank you for that. Matt and Lydia, I have other questions for you, but might you have anything you want to contribute regarding this issue of surveillance and privacy that is in different ways parts of your work also?
I have something, it's funny because most of that I've been thinking about in sort of the opposite way, particularly in regards to policing. Within the African American community, forever we've talked about how abusive the police officers have been in the larger community, to the point that like the stories seemed absurd and were not really believed even by a lot of people within the community. There was always like, well, you must have done this or you must have done that, in part as a sort of self-denial for something you couldn't really change, and had to deal with, and wanting to have the belief that if you just do everything perfectly, what you just heard happening to that person won't happen to you. But that's been the massive change for me with everyone walking around with video cameras, is all of a sudden we've been able to see how the police force actually behaves. And, before this, most of our understanding of how policing works comes from propaganda on TV, where the police are the stars and they are the heroes and everybody else is a criminal. And even if they're not caught for the right crime, they're still a criminal, so it doesn't really matter if you break the law to try and take them down. And so on the opposite end with the surveillance, like having police be recorded, having their cars record them, having their body cams record them when they don't turn them off, all these things that have weighted in that direction as well. And so, it's funny because when I was working on this book, I was also looking at all the stuff from the UFO things that have been popping up since 2017, when there was a New York Times article about, unidentified objects. And one of the things they both have in common is they're both things people talked about, being that nobody believed them. And then now all of a sudden there's video, and, of course, with UFOs, it could just be, Chinese drones or something, but there's video of something there. And so like the opposite of the surveillance, not just with tracking us down, is also getting some sort of proof to things that we just refuse to believe. That to me has been seismic. We wouldn't have the George Floyd moment if we did not have, hyper surveillance, honestly.
That's really apt, Matt. It really is amazing how, on one hand, to my mind, Snowden's critique of our surveillance state is urgent, right? He was telling us something about the capacity for our government to use the data that it's collecting to repress us, if not now, that down the line. And that feels very like something I want to pay attention to. And as you're saying, Matt, very correctly, our capacity, these same devices that are taking our data from us, quantifying it, putting into algorithms, doing myriad things with it. The same technology is empowering, and has enabled people, and particularly Black people, to hold the criminal justice system accountable in ways that have been really difficult before. Give and take,
Amoral technology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not as simple as one way, and obviously it damages us as a community, as a species in so many ways. And there's also some unexpected positive side effects that happen too.
Yeah, that same two-headed beast of progress that has been with us for certainly centuries, but obviously much longer too. Matt, I'm going to come back to you in a second about some of the things you just mentioned. But Lydia, I wanted to check in with you. Anything you want to add to this conversation right here?
Yeah, the current storytelling and possible future storytelling and past storytelling are kind of linked to this notion that surveillance tracks back to convincing a citizenry that who's property and who isn't, and what is criminality and what isn't, and who gets to be a full person and who doesn't. And so early in most cultural formations of the city-state, laborers and women and child laborers and queer people and poor people and, you know, criminality and property codings were the first forms of surveillance. You know, what's the use value of a human, and who has the power to convince the sort of labor force of humans that they're there only to serve the state, even as far as a woman's body bearing children being in service of the state with not full autonomy for her own body. And so surveillance is sort of the evolution of very old ideas and codings around law, property, and criminality that those older stories are interesting to keep dredging back up and holding next to, you know, now we have iPhones because they're intimately connected, that it's an old story, not a new story. It just has new forms. But I do love the idea that the very forms that oppress and repress disenfranchised groups of people are also, when the sort of legions of regular folk get that mode of production, sorry to sound all old school Marxist, but when they get the mode of production in the hands of, you know, people who want to be recognized as fully human, it makes a good fire.
Like the printing press that was first, you know, disseminated widely to print Bibles.
Yep.
All right. Matt, I just want to turn quickly to something you had already mentioned during your last set of comments. You were talking about the way in which you know, internet technology and the video camera, for example, can be used to provide incontrovertible evidence that something's occurring that people might be denying is occurring, right? And that's something that I feel like was a theme throughout your novel, this way that we might be afflicted by like a collective case of denialism or mass denialism. And that reminded me of 1984, you know, citizens are in 1984, they're supposed to reject everything they see with their eyes and their ears. So yeah, can you talk to us a little bit more about this denialism, or you know, this collective denialism that's seems to my mind to be at the heart of your fictional project?
Well, it's funny. Yeah, you bring up 1984 is also one of my favorite books, and there's so much in when I originally read 1984, you know, as a teen, seemed hyper exaggerated and over the top, and so much of it now going back, we have kind of milder versions of a lot of the same things that are already there. But the denialism part, I think denialism is a part of how we deal with stress and difficulties in our lives in general, right? So when things become too big for us to deal with them and they're horrible, one of the ways that we learn to cope is we just compartmentalize it and put it out of our minds. And if we didn't do that with a lot of stuff, we go nuts. You know, like your neighbor next door is, you know, a racist, misogynistic a-hole. At some point, you just have to try and forget that they're even there, you know, because you can't do anything about them, right? So there's very real ways that denial actually helps us. But the other side of it is that, you know, obviously the bigger side of it is that we get in a position where we're able to deny things because they're so big that, you know, even trying to deal with them is going to be more detrimental in your mind than actually going there. For instance, like when all this stuff was going on during the Trump presidency, I would be like online, and I'd be on Twitter, and I'd be ranting with all of my friends, like, what the hell, what the hell, what the hell. And then I would go to a coffee shop when I was in Houston, when I used to live in Houston, that a lot of the other people at the university and a lot of my students, everybody, we hung out at this coffee shop. And I see the same people have been ranting for months for the first time in person. And I'm like, hey, how's it going? They're like, fine, I'm good. How you doing? Good, good. Okay, good. All right, good. And then we'd walk away. And I saw that happening again and again and again. And, you know, whether it was dealing with climate, whether it was dealing with the rise of fascism, whether it was dealing with issues of race, it was like, by talking about it with people who agreed with you, it didn't seem like you were doing much, you know, to help the situation. Plus, God forbid that you guys only agree on 99.5% on the issue, because then immediately, you know, there's tension between like-minded people is one of the most intense kinds of attention, because we have higher standards for people who actually think like us. Or, you know, it's somebody who doesn't believe what you believe. And then it gets like, you know, can you convince anybody? No. So what ends up happening is we just don't talk about a lot of these things at all. And, you know, I saw that growing up with race, but I've seen it with climate change increasingly. And so it just seemed like, to me, it seemed like it made more sense to deal with the way we were thinking about major issues than it did to deal at this time for me with specific issues.
Thanks for that, Matt. You know, that was a really relatable anecdote regarding the way in which people had different discourse over the computer and in person, and maybe to my mind speaks to the way in which, again, this very technology that can give in certain ways might take away, or, you know, might be restraining in certain way. We have 5 minutes left. I'm gonna right now turn to Lidia, and we'll see what else we have time for. Lidia, you said something in an interview over the past year that really caught my eye, and you wrote, "Whether I am succeeding or not, I'm actually trying to unwrite an Americanness, and I'm trying to write toward a set of global possibilities where nations fall away and national definitions turn back into sediments." And that speaks to some of what you read also for us earlier. And I think that very statement might permeate, you know, our entire conversation and the 3 novels that are at the center of our conversation. But can you speak to us about that a little more? What is this that you're doing when you are unwriting Americanness, and what do you mean by making nation? How can we do that?
Well, every time I try to talk about this, I get in big trouble, so I'll keep it short.
Okay.
I'm just to put a nice version of it out there. I'm not very interested anymore the rest of my life in what a nation ethos is. I am interested at the individual level in understanding self as sediment, as opposed to self as center of the story or center of the action. And I am equally interested in what will the new adaptations be in terms of human relationships with each other and this planet we've effed up. What are the new acts of imagination that are required? And from my point of view, letting go of national pride and divisions between nations is part of what has put us in a binary war with ourselves. That, you know, one thing about being a writer is we get to inhabit the what if space, and a fiction writer especially can keep inhabiting the what if space. And this is why I'm so happy to be with these 2 writers who keep not answering the question, but opening the what if space up. And I'm willing to say breaking down definitions of nations is part of the what if space.
Do you feel especially demoralized in our current moment when it seemed like some of the possibility of a more transnational or nationally fluid existence that defined my 20s, let's say, just even in terms of the availability of flights or you know, or the existence of the EU in a certain form seems to be receding. I mean, the globe's nationalistic tendencies seem to be getting re-entrenched right now. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? We read more fiction,
You're
read your
asking
books.
me?
Yeah, yeah.
We do. We read more books, we make more art, we stay noisy, but I will remind us all something we already know, which is extreme oppressions and repressions breed their opposite. Vibrant art does come from those times of national or international or global crisis, because the pressure to shut it up or kill it is so extreme that that's when the liveliest art punches back up through or thrusts back up through. And I'm a melancholic person by nature, so I'm not extra sad. I'm very thrilled and excited by our current moment, because the vanguard of artists and activists alive and noisy right now are thrilling. One example would be the women cutting all their hair off in Iran right now. I mean, I think it's an exciting time, even as it's a completely oppressive, depressing time. That doesn't bother me. I came out of the chute depressed, so it's fine. I know how to do this.
I think that's a wonderful thing for a last word right there. I think we ended on just the right notes. I have to read something. Thank you, panelists, Jessamine Chan, Lidia Yuknavitch, and Matt Johnson. Folks in the audience, please remember you can order books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 17th year. And a reminder that if you're in New York City next week, the in-person festival takes place on October 2nd in downtown Brooklyn.